What if the first day of a new year didn't bring hope, but a warning? That question seemed to hang silently over the Walker Ranch as the winter sky dimmed into copper and blue, the last light sliding across the frozen fields of Montana. Abigail Walker sat tall in the saddle, the breath of her Mustang rising like ghosts in the cold air, and anyone looking from a distance might have mistaken her for a shadow of the mountains themselves, unyielding, solitary, and unwilling to bow. People loved to say she was too wild for her own good, too opinionated, too independent, too unwilling to marry and surrender the reins of her life to a man. But Abby had never viewed herself that way. To her, freedom was as necessary as breath. And in this new year, she meant to protect it more than ever. The day should have been quiet, but it wasn't. Inside the great house, her father, Judge Richard Walker, had arranged an unwanted New Year gathering. 3 men arrived in polished boots and stiff collars, ready to judge the woman they expected to conquer. Daniel Prescott came handsome and smiling, his charm sharpened like a knife. Charles Whitman carried the air of industry and calculation. Frederick Collins seemed born wealthy and incapable of hiding it. Alongside them, Mrs. Prescott surveyed the ranch as though determining its value. Abby had stepped into the parlor without hesitation, shoulders square, eyes clear. She spoke simply, without apology. She ran the ranch. She worked alongside her men. She rode before dawn. She shot straighter than most cowboys. She was not waiting to be saved. 2 suitors left offended, whispering her name like a scandal. Daniel remained, gaze probing, confident he could bend her. He told her she needed guidance. She told him she needed respect. Her father's silence afterward said more than his words. Later, when the guests had gone, he warned her that loneliness was a real and merciless thing. Abby listened, but she did not bow. Freedom mattered more than approval, more than marriage, more than fear. And yet, even freedom was about to be tested. Thomas Bryant rode hard from the northern pasture late that afternoon, calling her name as frost clung to his coat. He reported cattle scattered where they shouldn't be, and hoofprints belonging to strangers. Rustlers. Abby did not hesitate. She ordered saddles, checked ammunition, and rode out with Thomas and 2 other men. The wind cut sharp, biting at exposed skin, but danger warmed the blood. The northern range unfolded beneath a pale winter sky, fences running like scars across the frozen ground. Tracks told a story. Men unfamiliar with the land, pushing cattle through snow, bold enough to trespass in daylight hours. Abby followed the trail, jaw tight. Rustlers weren't new, but lately they'd grown organized, confident, ruthless. The riders eventually appeared ahead, 3 of them, armed and restless, sitting their horses like they owned the land beneath them. One called out that the cattle had simply wandered. Another rested a hand too casually near his gun. The third watched Abby like a challenge. Her men shifted behind her, uncertain whether to speak or shoot. The moment tightened like a drawn bowstring. The younger rustler's fingers twitched toward his revolver. Abby already knew what came next. But before the gun cleared leather, another rider thundered into view from the rise above the creek. A single shot cracked the silence, not aimed to kill, but to slice the air. The rustler froze. For a breath, no one moved. Then the stranger emerged from the last wash of daylight. Tall, broad-shouldered, weathered. His face carried a long, jagged scar slashing down one cheek, stark against skin hardened by sun and storms. He didn't boast, he didn't threaten. He spoke with a calm certainty that suggested he had already measured the men before him and found them lacking. "Leave," he said, "and don't come back." The rustlers hesitated, weighed their chances, then retreated into the distance like a bad memory that would surely return. Abby studied the stranger. His eyes were a winter gray that revealed little. His voice carried discipline, pain, experience. He introduced himself simply as Ethan Marlowe and admitted he had drifted through Montana in search of quiet work. but the way he watched the horizon suggested he never truly rested. Abby thanked him, though she asked why a man like him would involve himself. Ethan shrugged like the answer belonged to the past. He warned her that this was no ordinary rustling. Someone was coordinating, testing defenses. If the ranch wasn't prepared, worse would come. She believed him. She also sensed he guarded secrets as tightly as one guards breath in winter. Back at the ranch, the New Year fire burned in the great room, but the warmth didn't ease the tension. Abby told her father everything. He doubted this drifter. He doubted her judgment, but necessity speaks louder than pride when danger rises. Ethan agreed to stay temporarily, helping secure the ranch. He moved with quiet precision, reorganizing patrols, teaching the men to function like a disciplined unit rather than loose cowboys. They resisted at first, but results have a way of silencing argument. Through long hours in the frost-bitten dawns and star-cold nights, Abby and Ethan worked side by side. She learned that pain had carved itself into him long before the scar appeared on his face. He rarely spoke of it, but grief lingered around him like a shadow that refused to leave. Still, he respected her, not just as a woman, but as a leader, as an equal. It stirred something in her chest she had never allowed herself to feel, something dangerous, something hopeful, and all the while, danger moved closer. Word traveled that raiders had torched small ranch buildings east of the river. Families slept lightly, listening for hooves in the night. Abby refused to stand behind men. She rode, she planned, she prepared. Ethan never asked her to step aside. Instead, he watched her with a quiet admiration he never put into words. This was how the new year arrived, not with fireworks or laughter, but with fear sharpening the air and hearts beating faster than usual. And yet, in the midst of it all, Abby found herself wondering whether danger was sometimes the path fate used to bring two stubborn souls together. The question returned. What if the new year didn't begin with hope, but with a test? One that would decide not only the future of the Walker Ranch, but the price of loving someone who carried darkness in his past. The answer, for now, waited in the gathering night. The next morning, the New Year's sun rose slow and pale over the Walker Ranch, but Ethan Marlowe moved as if there were no time to waste. He walked the yard with Abby at his side, asking short, pointed questions. Where the rifles were stored, how fast the men could be roused, which directions gave the clearest view of the valley. He studied the barn, the bunkhouse, the sheds, the line of cottonwoods along the creek, and turned the whole place into a mental map of strengths and weaknesses. There was no swagger in him, only a quiet urgency that made Abby's stomach tighten. Every answer she gave felt like another admission that they were more vulnerable than she wanted to believe. When he finally said, "We can fix this," she realized she had been holding her breath. By mid-morning, the ranch no longer looked like a loose cluster of buildings, but like a position being fortified. Ethan split the hands into small groups, posted rotating sentries on the ridges, and drilled them until their easy camaraderie turned into sharp attention. He had them practice grabbing rifles and taking cover, calling signals, moving as one instead of scattering like startled cattle. When one of the older cowboys muttered about taking orders from a stranger, Ethan didn't argue. He handed the man his own revolver and told him to hit a tin can on the fence. After 2 misses, Ethan took back the gun and knocked the can away with one clean shot, then simply said, "You don't have to like me. You just have to stay alive." No one complained after that. From the porch, Judge Richard Walker watched with narrowed eyes, torn between respect and suspicion. Later, he cornered Ethan with clipped questions about where he'd learned to command men that way. Ethan answered that he had once worn a badge and chased men who laughed at the law, and that too many graves had been dug because good folks thought danger would arrive politely. He didn't offer more. The long scar down his cheek said enough. The days that followed took on a new rhythm, hard, cold, and strangely close. Abby rode the fence lines with Ethan, checking for cut wire and unfamiliar hoof prints, listening to the way he read the land. He noticed details the others missed. A gate left slightly ajar, Tracks that doubled back for no good reason, smoke too far off to belong to any neighbor they knew. At widow Sarah Parker's small place, they found Sarah tightening boards on her porch while her boy Michael wrestled with a nervous mare. Ethan didn't stride in like a hero. He crouched beside the boy, guided his hands on the reins, and talked him through calming the horse until it stood still, steam rising from its nostrils. Sarah's shoulders loosened just a little as she thanked them, but fear lingered in her eyes. Abby promised they would not let anyone drive the Parkers from their land. On the ride back, she asked Ethan why he cared about people he'd just met. He hesitated, then said quietly that once, in another territory, people had trusted him and paid the price when he misjudged the men he was hunting. He didn't explain further, but the guilt in his voice made Abby's chest ache. The rustlers never fully vanished. They only retreated to the edges, like wolves testing a fence line. Strange tracks appeared near the north ridge, then faded into the hills. A single rider was spotted on a far rise at dusk, watching the ranch before turning away. One morning they found a stretch of fence cut and a few head missing. The snow churned and muddled. Ethan studied the ground, jaw tight, and told Abby this wasn't random. Someone was testing their reactions, learning how quickly they moved, how far they chased. That night at the kitchen table, he sketched a rough map of the valley, marking each sighting, each theft. The pattern curved toward the Walker Ranch like a slow hook. "They're tightening around you," he said. "When they hit for real, they'll want it to hurt." Fear ran a cold line down Abby's spine, but underneath it lay something harder. "Then we make sure it hurts them more," she replied. For a moment, the scar on his face softened with the hint of a smile before his expression turned serious again. Not all threats wore dust and guns. A few days later, Abby rode into town alone and found Daniel Prescott waiting by the general store. Coat immaculate, smile polished. He greeted her as if the memory of being rejected in her father's parlor had been smoothed over by time, as if they were old friends. With practiced concern, he spoke of rumors. Rustlers growing bolder, ranchers feeling cornered, opportunities to protect one's future by selling early to interests back east. The way he said it made Abby's skin crawl. When she told him the Walker land was not for sale, his smile sharpened at the edges. He warned her that stubbornness could be costly in uncertain times. She told him she'd pay that cost herself, turned on her heel, and left him standing in the street. That night, when she repeated the conversation to Ethan, his eyes went flat and cold. "Men like Prescott," he said, "didn't like being told no. They hired other men to convince you you'd been wrong all along." As the new year settled deeper into winter, nights at the ranch grew longer in more ways than one. After the hands turned in, Abby sometimes found Ethan alone in the kitchen, coffee cooling between his hands, gaze lost somewhere far beyond the frosted window. Their late conversations began with practical questions. How many men to send to watch the Parker place, whether to warn other neighbors, how much ammunition they had, and drifted toward things neither of them had ever said out loud to anyone. Ethan spoke in fragments, about a powerful man back east who had decided to make him a scapegoat, about reports twisted into lies, about running not because he was guilty, but because innocence meant nothing against money and influence. He didn't yet say the name Malcolm Graves, but the outline of such a man was there in every bitter breath. Abby, in turn, admitted what it felt like to be told her whole life would be a failure if she didn't fit inside a role picked out for her before she was born. Somewhere in the quiet between those confessions, something shifted. Their shoulders brushed when they leaned over the same map. Their hands touched briefly, passing a lantern. Their eyes met and held a fraction too long. They didn't name whatever was forming between them. Naming it would make it harder to ignore. Then, one evening, Thomas burst through the door with snow in his beard and alarm in his eyes. A neighbor passing by had seen riders at dusk near the Parker place. More than a simple visit, keeping to the trees, watching the house. Ethan listened without interrupting, then looked at Abby, and she saw the confirmation in his face. The slow hook he'd traced on the map was starting to close. "They're moving," he said, "and they picked the Parkers to make their point." Abby's pulse hammered, but her voice came out steady. They would not leave Sarah and Michael alone. Orders moved through the bunkhouse. Rifles came from racks. Lanterns flared to life in the dark yard. As they saddled up, the winter wind cut sharp across the valley, carrying the promise of something about to break. Ethan's gray eyes met Abby's in the flickering light, and for one brief, unguarded second, all the walls between them fell. There was fear there, and determination, and something warmer that neither had time to speak. Then they swung into their saddles and rode out into the night toward the Parker place, straight toward the fire and blood and betrayal waiting on the other side of the darkness. The night split open before they even reached the Parker place. Smoke rode the wind like a warning, and then the glow appeared over the ridge, pulsing against the winter sky. By the time Abby and Ethan crested the last rise, the house was already burning, flames tearing through the roof, embers scattering into the dark like sparks of war. Gunfire cracked from the shadows. Shapes moved between the trees, men shouting, horses rearing, the chaos of a coordinated raid. Ethan didn't hesitate. He called positions with a calm that cut through the panic, sending riders to flank, ordering the rest to use the barn and stone walls for cover. Abby rode straight toward Michael, who was crouched behind the well, frozen between fear and obedience to his mother's orders. She hauled him behind the woodpile just as a bullet splintered the well's edge. Sarah Parker clutched the Bible to her chest, eyes wide with horror as the roof of her home gave way and collapsed into roaring fire. For a heartbeat, Abby felt the weight of helplessness pressed down like the winter sky. Then Ethan's voice broke through. "Stay with me," he called, steady, unshaken. She did. The rustlers weren't careless this time. They moved in coordinated waves, testing cover, falling back, then advancing again. They expected easy prey. Instead, they found discipline. The Walker hands returned fire not in wild panic, but with precision drilled into them over long days of training. One man went down near the barn. Another fled, clutching his shoulder. A third, masked by a scarf, shouted orders with cold authority. Ethan tracked him through the chaos, realizing he wasn't merely a raider. He was a leader. And this wasn't robbery. This was a message. The message burned just as bright as the Parker home. For nearly an hour, the battle swayed like a tide. Every moment stretched thin between courage and terror. When the last rustlers broke and fled into the trees, leaving the house a smoking ruin and the yard littered with shattered fence rails, the silence felt heavier than the gunfire. Abby wrapped a blanket around Sarah's shaking shoulders while Michael buried his face in her coat. The widow had lost nearly everything but her child and her land, and even that last part now felt fragile. Ethan stood a few paces away, staring into the embers. His jaw tightened. He'd seen this before. Families driven out not by random violence, but by design. Later, once the wounded were tended and the yard quieted, Ethan dragged one of the captured rustlers into the barn. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply asked questions until fear did the rest. The man finally admitted what Ethan already suspected. They weren't stealing cattle for profit. They were working under orders. Someone with money and ambition had promised protection and reward if they could make small ranchers see reason and sell out. The name slipped eventually. Reluctant and shaking, Prescott. Abby felt her stomach twist. Daniel Prescott, with his polished boots and polished words, wasn't circling like a suitor anymore. He was circling like a predator. And above him, pulling the strings, was a man the rustler only dared call Mr. Graves. Malcolm Graves, a railroad baron whose business dealings stretched farther than the horizon and whose sense of morality had dried up long ago. The revelation snapped everything into place. The ranches weren't being robbed. They were being softened, broken down, pressured until families signed away their land for a fraction of its worth. And Prescott, arrogant enough to think he'd go unnoticed, had chosen Abby's refusal as an insult worth punishing. Ethan's scar caught the lantern light as he turned away, his expression carved from stone. Now Abby finally heard the full truth. Malcolm Graves had once tried to bend the law to his will, and when Ethan refused to play along, Graves had turned the law itself into a weapon against him. False reports, paid witnesses, charges that never quite stuck but destroyed his life nonetheless. Ethan had walked away from the badge, carrying the shame of crimes he hadn't committed, and the scar a hired killer had carved into his face as a reminder. He had drifted ever since, a good man forced into exile while Graves grew stronger. The fire at the Parker home made Abby's decision for her. If they stayed quiet, others would burn. If they waited, the rustlers would come again, and next time they might not leave survivors. With Judge Walker's reluctant blessing, Abby and Ethan coordinated with neighboring ranchers, pulling them together not as scattered families, but as a united defense. Rifles were cleaned, horses were readied, word spread quietly but firmly. If Malcolm Graves wanted to tighten his grip on Montana, he would meet resistance. Powerful, organized resistance. Daniel Prescott didn't vanish. He came to the ranch in broad daylight, dressed in his finest coat, smiling as if tragedy were merely business weather. He offered assistance, sympathy, legal aid, and quiet arrangements to secure safety in uncertain times. Abby looked him in the eye and told him she knew exactly what he was. Ethan stood beside her, silent but imposing, the scar on his face drawing Prescott's gaze like a magnet. For the first time, the polished businessman faltered. His charming veneer cracked, just enough for Abby to glimpse the threat beneath. "You're making a mistake," he warned, soft as silk and twice as cold. "Some men don't forget insults." Abby replied that neither did she. The next days were a blur of preparation and simmering dread. The rustlers regrouped. Their numbers swelled. The attacks shifted from scattered to strategic. Barns burned, cattle stampeded, riders vanished on night patrols. Graves's invisible hand tightened until the valley felt like a trap. But Abby refused to abandon hope, and Ethan refused to abandon her. Their conversations grew fewer, shorter, but heavier with unspoken truth. Love was a dangerous luxury, especially when enemies watched from every tree line. Yet in stolen moments, sharing coffee before dawn, standing shoulder to shoulder while marking positions on a map, exchanging a glance across a busy yard, they found it anyway. Love here wasn't soft. It was forged under pressure, wrapped in gun smoke in winter, rooted in mutual respect instead of control. When the next attack came, it wasn't meant to wound. It was meant to finish the fight. Riders swept out of the hills under cover of twilight, dozens strong. Fires bloomed across the valley like malignant flowers. The Walker Ranch became the battleground Graves had hoped for. Yet this time, the defenders were ready. Sentries signaled. Traps slowed the advance. Rifle shots echoed in disciplined rhythm. Abby rode through the chaos like a force of nature, refusing to yield an inch of ground. Ethan led the defense, every command deliberate, every decision measured. He fought not only for justice, but for absolution. Proof that the man Graves had tried to destroy still existed. By the time the smoke cleared, several rustlers lay captured, including the scarred leader whose voice had driven the raid. Under pressure and the promise of federal law rather than frontier justice, he revealed everything. The conspiracy was broader than anyone wanted to believe, laced with bribery, intimidation, and political leverage. And somewhere out there, in an office lined with ledgers and ironclad contracts, Malcolm Graves thought himself untouchable. Abby and Ethan knew better. The battle had changed something forever. The valley wasn't just land anymore. It was a line in the sand. Abby stood beside Ethan at dawn the next morning, frost glittering on fence rails. The world quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after violence, when everyone counts the cost and wonders what still remains. The smoke-stained sky looked bruised. Michael clung to his mother's hand. Judge Walker spoke of marshals, warrants, and official channels. But Ethan knew how far Graves's reach extended. If justice were ever to mean anything again, They would have to chase it beyond Montana. And that meant leaving the familiar behind. Abby didn't flinch. Freedom was worth fighting for, even if it meant crossing borders and crossing the line between safety and love. She looked at Ethan, seeing not just the scar, not just the past, but the man who had stood beside her when everything began to burn. And she knew the road ahead would be darker still. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. Winter loosened its grip on the valley just enough for the roads to open, and that was when Abby and Ethan left Montana behind. There was no fanfare, no goodbye celebration, only quiet hugs on the porch, a few whispered prayers, and the understanding that they might never ride back the same. Judge Walker pressed a bundle of legal letters into Ethan's gloved hand, documents that could open doors or, if needed, slam them. Then he turned to Abby, voice unsteady for the first time in years, and told her that strength didn't mean shouldering everything alone. She squeezed his hand and promised she knew that now. But the truth was, the only person she fully trusted to ride beside her was the man with the scar and the watchful eyes who was already tightening the cinch on his saddle. They rode southeast through open country, snow thinning into muddy spring melt, the land widening around them like an endless breath. On long stretches, neither spoke. Silence wasn't emptiness with them. It was understanding. Sometimes, when they stopped to make camp beneath iron-gray skies, Ethan would stare into the fire, the flames licking over the scar on his cheek, and Abby knew he was walking again through every mistake, every betrayal, every life he hadn't been able to save. One night, when the wind rattled the trees like bones, she quietly asked him what hurt the most. He didn't answer right away. When he did, the words came slow. It wasn't the lies Graves spread. It wasn't losing the badge. It was realizing that the system he once believed in could be twisted like barbed wire around the necks of good people. Abby listened, and something fragile but powerful settled between them. Not romance painted in bright colors, but the steady recognition of two people who chose each other despite the weight they carried. Kansas greeted them with smoke from rail lines and the restless hum of men chasing money. Dodge City felt loud and close after the wide Montana sky. Saloons, rail depots, polished boots, stepping around dirty children selling papers. It was the kind of place where trouble wore a nice suit and tipped its hat. Malcolm Graves's name traveled through the streets like a shadow. They didn't go to him first. They went to the ones he had broken. Widows, displaced ranchers, former deputies, a bookkeeper who had fled under threat. Each story fit like another piece in a dark mosaic. Bribes, false land seizures, fabricated charges, and anyone who objected was ruined or buried. Many had once trusted Ethan before the truth turned inside out. Some still looked at him with doubt, but most saw the remorse in his face, the scar like a signature carved into regret, and realized he hadn't been the author of their pain, only another victim of the man behind the curtain. Inside a quiet boarding house room lit by a single lamp, Abby and Ethan built the case brick by brick. Names, dates, ledgers, secret payments, witnesses who finally dared to speak. The federal marshals listened, cautious but interested, warned men who had seen enough to know that the rich were not always innocent. Still, they warned the pair that Graves had influence stretching into courts and banks and newspapers. A single mistake could unravel everything. Abby didn't blink. Ethan simply said they weren't here to make mistakes. Eventually, there came the moment they could no longer avoid. Malcolm Graves agreed to meet. His office overlooked the tracks like a throne gazing over its kingdom. He was older than Abby expected, but power aged some men into steel rather than dust. His smile was professional, polite, even admiring as he studied Abby like a curiosity. With Ethan, he was less kind. He spoke of wasted potential, of loyalty misunderstood, of the inconvenience of men who believed justice could exist without price. The air in the room felt thin. Graves hinted at offers, money, protection, an easy life far from here. He spoke of how difficult it would be if the wrong people suffered accidents. And then, almost casually, He implied that he had the means to erase Ethan from the map if this crusade continued. Abby's pulse slowed, dangerous and calm. She told him that fear was only effective when people believed their lives meant nothing. Hers did. Ethan's did. And so did every farmer and widow and child Graves had swallowed in the name of progress. Something in the Baron's expression hardened. For the first time, he seemed to recognize them not as nuisances, but as opponents. The raid, when it came, happened after dark. Federal marshals stormed the hidden strong room behind Graves's office wall where iron safes lined the brick like a vault of sins. Ledgers surfaced, names, accounts, illegal seizures, payouts to hired gunmen and crooked officials. Every secret he thought buried came into the light. Graves didn't rage. He didn't shout. He only stared at Ethan, eyes filled with a cold fury, as if this man with a scar had somehow betrayed the natural order. Abby stood between them, spine straight, unyielding. The marshals read the charges while the faint whistle of the train cut through the night like a funeral song. In the days that followed, statements were taken, papers filed, warrants signed. And yet, beneath the relief, a strange quiet grew between Abby and Ethan. Victory had a cost. It meant choices. Ethan was no longer a hunted man. He could reclaim a life beyond drifting, beyond shadows. Abby could return to Montana to rebuild, to lead. But neither one of those futures looked right without the other. One evening, sitting on the steps outside the courthouse while the city buzzed behind them, he finally asked the question that had hung unsaid since the valley first caught fire. How do two people build something together when their worlds had always been made of battlefields? Abby answered simply, that maybe love didn't erase their scars or silence the past. Maybe it just meant not carrying them alone anymore. He took her hand, not as possession, but as a promise. When they finally turned their horses toward Montana again, the rails running beside them seemed to hum with change. Graves would face trial. The truth had been dragged into daylight. Ethan's name was cleared. And somewhere beneath the ache of everything they had endured, a quiet hope began to anchor itself. Rough-edged, imperfect, but real. They were not naive. The West would always be a place where power could rot and greed could spread. But now, Abby and Ethan understood that standing together, freely, honestly, without ownership or surrender, was its own kind of revolution. And as the plains rolled back beneath their horses' hooves, they knew the story was not ending. It was simply turning toward whatever waited beneath the wide, watchful sky. The train whistle faded behind them long before the mountains returned to frame the sky. Montana waited like a memory, rediscovered, open and endless, as Abby and Ethan rode the final stretch back to the Walker Ranch. Winter had loosened into early spring, the snow thinning into pale ribbons along the fence lines. Smoke curled gently from the ranch house chimney, not from fire and ruin this time, but from ordinary life continuing. It felt strange, almost fragile, to arrive without dread pressing on their shoulders. Justice had not come fast or clean, but it had come. Malcolm Graves now faced federal charges that would follow him farther than money or charm ever could. The marshals had the ledgers, the witnesses, the paper trail of bribes and lies. Newspapers from Kansas to Washington printed his downfall in heavy ink, and in every quiet paragraph that restored Ethan's name, there was the echo of truth returning to the light. The rustlers scattered once their benefactor fell. Some were tried. Some fled. Daniel Prescott's careful life unraveled in courtrooms instead of on dusty streets. Influence slipped through his fingers like sand. He stopped sending letters. He stopped pretending he had ever been harmless. That chapter closed without spectacle, and Abby preferred it that way. The West had already seen enough smoke. Judge Walker met them at the porch, his face worn with worry, finally allowed to soften into relief. He shook Ethan's hand with the respect of one lawman recognizing another, even if their paths had marked them differently. Eleanor Walker hugged Abby longer than usual, whispering a quiet prayer into her hair. Sarah Parker and young Michael came soon after, the boy taller, braver now, though his eyes still flickered at loud sounds. Life had not forgotten its scars, but it was learning how to live with them. Ethan walked the perimeter of the ranch the next morning, not out of fear, but out of habit. He paused sometimes, touching a fence post or watching the ridgeline as though acknowledging old ghosts before letting them rest. When Abby joined him, he looked almost uncertain for the first time since she'd known him. Freedom was different when it wasn't simply the absence of chains. Now it came with possibility, with choice. He confessed, in that calm, steady way of his, that he wasn't sure how to be a man without a target on his back. Abby told him the truth. No one ever really stops being afraid. They only learn to stop letting fear choose their future. And he smiled, the scar on his cheek softening rather than hardening his expression. The townsfolk shifted too. Where once Ethan had been a name spoken with doubt, he was now greeted with nods, with quiet thanks, with stories of how his training had saved lives when violence rolled across the plains. Some women brought bread. Some men brought awkward apologies. He accepted both with grace. Abby, who had once stood on the edge of society's expectations, now found that same society stepping, carefully, imperfectly, toward her. They still whispered sometimes, calling her too bold, too stubborn, too unwilling to bend. But more often now they said it differently, with respect, with gratitude, with a trace of admiration. Their love did not erupt into fireworks or grand speeches. It unfolded like the land itself, slow, steady, inevitable. They worked together. They argued. They laughed. They rode across the range with the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed to guard their hearts. Ethan asked to stay not as protector or overseer, but as partner. Abby agreed, not as a woman finally surrendering to a man, but as a soul recognizing another soul who chose her without trying to tame her. The date of their wedding passed like a warm wind rather than a storm. Small ceremony, simple vows. Families and neighbors gathered not to witness possession, but to recognize equality. Judge Walker's voice trembled as he blessed them. Sarah Parker cried quietly. Michael threw flower petals like confetti and pretended not to cry at all. Abby looked across the valley afterward and felt something she had never truly allowed herself to feel, peace that didn't cost her freedom. The new year had begun with smoke and fear, but it ended with twilight settling soft across the plains. The ranch recovered. Calves were born. Fences rebuilt. Laughter returned to the bunkhouse. Some nights, Abby and Ethan sat together on the hill overlooking the land they now shared, the sky painted in streaks of fading sun. He would trace the edge of his scar without shame, and she would rest her hand over his, not to hide it, but to honor what they had survived. They spoke honestly about the past and the future, about the world that would continue to test them. Love didn't erase darkness. It simply refused to let darkness win. On the last evening before spring fully claimed the valley, Abby asked Ethan whether he ever imagined his life ending here, beneath Montana's wide sky. He said no. Then he added quietly that he had never imagined belonging anywhere at all. She leaned into him, the wind soft, the world vast and open. Freedom had always been Abby Walker's first loyalty. Now she understood that love and freedom were never meant to be enemies. Real love didn't cage. It rode beside you, through storms and uncertainty, through fire and betrayal, through trials and redemption. And as the first stars blinked awake over the plains, they both knew that whatever came next, hard years, good years, quiet seasons, fierce battles, they would face it side by side, not as savior and rescued, not as master and follower, but as equals. Two hearts, once wounded by the world, now walking forward together beneath the western sky, unbroken and unafraid. Slowly now, the story drifts to a close. The fires have burned out, the gunshots have faded, and the quiet breath of the plains settles into the night. Abby Walker remains the woman she has always been. Strong, steady, unwilling to surrender the truth of who she is. Yet now, she no longer stands alone against the wind. Ethan Marlowe, scarred but redeemed, has laid down the burden of running, finally resting in a place where he is seen with honesty and kindness. Their love is not loud, it is patient. It does not trap or demand. It simply walks beside them, step by gentle step, as the new year spreads across Montana like soft dawn. The valley remembers every hardship, but it also remembers healing. Families rebuild, children laugh again, justice, long delayed, finally breathes. And in the final light of evening, when the sky turns silver blue and the world grows still, Abby and Ethan stand together looking out over their land, their future stretching wide and open. The picture slowly fades, not into darkness, but into peace, like a whisper lingering in the heart long after the story ends. End of article. Good night.